Hi, everybody. Welcome to this NYSI chat. Today with me are my colleagues, Matt, Sofyan, and Jamie. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Thanks for joining me. Today we have a very interesting topic about the effects of Ramadan fasting in elite Muslim badminton players. So maybe, Sofyan, you could kick us off about what Ramadan fasting is all about.
Okay, so with anything, we start with the what. So what Ramadan fasting about is basically a period of where an annual religious obligation where Muslims who are above puberty or pubertal age and above abstain from food and fluids from sunrise to sunset for over a period of about 29 to 30 days. So this sunrise to sunset is obviously dependent on location. So in Singapore, it's about 13 to 14 hours. But if you are in other countries, if it's summer, it could be longer. Or if it's winter, it can be very short. Then during this period also, Muslims generally usually have about 2 meals, one before sunrise and one before sunset. One after sunset, one after sunset. Yep, so that's basically what fasting is for the masses. Yeah.
So what are some of the major adjustments the average person has to make? We'll deal with the elite athletes later, but the average person.
Okay, so the adjustments that the average Muslim will have to make during this period is mainly two. So first is obviously the more obvious eating habits. So during sunrise to sunset, they are supposed to abstain from all consuming any food or drinks. So that's the first part, and because of that, chances are all the effects you expect from from abstaining from food and drink during this time period is there, such as more lethargy, a bit more thirsty, things like that. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is actually the sleeping habit. Because sunrise in Singapore is about earlier than that. So it's around, they have to wake up by 5:46. I think by the time Ramadan hits, about 5:46. So that means they have to finish eating by 5:46. And to do that, they will have to wake up at least an hour earlier. So about 4:45, 5. So that means in that aspect, the sleep will be shortened. And then most Muslims also engage in night prayers during the fasting month, so they will sleep even later. So the second aspect is that their sleep will likely be shortened, they will be sleep deprived and things like that. So that is the second habit that is likely to be affected because of fasting.
So on a related note, I wanted to ask Jamie, what are its similarities with intermittent fasting or even differences?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting because they are in fact quite different. Like what Sofyan mentioned, for Ramadan, the fasting takes place in the day. But for intermittent fasting, the fasting actually takes place at night. So it's considered a more nocturnal form of fasting. So that's the first key difference. The second key difference, I think Sofyan will chip in, will be the different types of food that people actually eat. Like for intermittent fasting, usually when they break their fast, they still eat a certain type of diet in order to lose them and manage their weight. But for Ramadan, I need to let people talk about it.
No. So for Ramadan, there is no restrictions on the type of food you can eat. But obviously, we have recommendations. So-called what we call the prophetic traditions. The prophetic traditions, they encourage you to eat dates or fruits and things like that. But strictly speaking, there is no limitation on what you can eat. So which is why we have some people who, after breaking fast, they will wallop everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to say, because like it's quite funny, not quite funny, but I was quite intrigued by some of the catering packages that some Muslim stores are offering. Because I'm quite a big fan of nasi padang, right? So I like it. I was like, wow, she looks quite good. Yeah, but quite different from the usual kind of recommendations that people will go on for intermittent fasting. Like the catering menu as compared to the menu for intermittent fasting. I would say the caloric content, everything are quite different. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for outlining the differences. And going back to the study, Sofyan, that you took part in, maybe you could help sketch out for us what you were investigating and give people a sense of who you were studying and what were you measuring.
Okay, so the research study was led by Abdul Rashid Aziz from Singapore Sports Institute. So we wanted to investigate all the different implications or effects that Ramadan fasting would have on the training athletes. So we know for sure that it will affect in terms of fatigue and things like that. But we wanted to ask the question was, does Ramadan fasting still affect skill performance. Because we know for sure that because of the change in eating habits and sleep habits, you are likely to be more tired or not as much energy. But will it still affect skill performance? So that was the main intention or research question we wanted to ask. Does Ramadan fasting actually affect skill performance? So what we did was we looked at the badminton players. So SBA, they were between about 18 to 25 years of age, and we actually had them to we tested their skill performance in two conditions. One is during Ramadan, and one is during non-Ramadan, the control period. So skill performance is defined by two things: the ability to do the low serve and the ability to do the high overhead smash. Then for these two skills, we look at three things: consistency, accuracy, and velocity of the shuttlecock. So consistency, because we made them do the skill 8 times, and then we look at the consistency between the eight repetitions. We look at the accuracy, whether he hits the target area, and then we look at the velocity, speed of the shuttlecock, whether there was any differences and trade-off. And then what we found was, in summary, was there was no significant difference between the Ramadan and the control. Now, it's important to note that we actually tested it after 2 weeks of fasting. That means they have already adjusted, so they are already in fasting mode. Their bodies have adjusted to it. And we found no difference between Ramadan and control, especially when we started the test. That means the test consists of 2 sets of 20 minutes. And then we started, there was no significant difference between these two skills. However, there was a slight decrease in performance for the overhead smash after the first set and at the end of the set. So that could suggest that fatigue or cognitive decline have set in, and then they might have been a bit more tired, and that's why their performance were affected.
So this is a decrease in velocity.
Yes.
Okay.
But accuracy still stayed the same. Thank you, Leslie. So the accuracy still the same, and consistency still stayed the same. So in terms of ability to perform the skills, they were still able to do it. Just that maybe velocity went down. They were not able to move it as fast as possible.
I'm just curious, did the elite athletes sleep less as a result of having to change their sleep patterns?
No, in this case, the athletes, technically, they were in a controlled environment. So they were asleep by 11:30 at night. And then in the morning, they will wake up at 5 to 5:30. However, in this case, we did not control their sleep. So after 5:30, they were allowed to go back to sleep. And then they only started training later at 8. So the sleep will definitely be impaired, especially the cycle, but maybe not too much difference in total volume of sleep, if that makes sense. Yeah.
But even changing sleep patterns, that affects your circadian rhythms, and
Yes, you are right.
so that still has some obvious effects, would it not?
Yes, it does, and that can be seen in the results where you can see we so-called measured, we used the Boone scale, the Brunel mood scale, and there was some slight differences between Ramadan condition and control condition, but yeah.
So I guess coming to the implications for youth athletes, how do we translate some of the findings for youth athletes? Because I suppose with youth athletes, we're talking about, first of all, not as experienced, perhaps mentally or emotionally able to handle the fatigue effects. I suppose, what can we translate into our support for youth athletes in this study?
So for me, the takeaway or what we can use for the youth athlete is basically that, one, we can carry on with skill or technique-based trainings for the youth athletes in Ramadan. So there is no reason why we should not do skills training. Like I say, I'm sure we all know that maybe in Ramadan, most coaches naturally would want to adjust the training volume, or the training time, which makes sense because they tend to be more tired, and they tend to be more fatigued. But they can still factor in skills or technique training. One. Two, it's also possible based on other research that you can actually schedule this type of training earlier on in the day when they are a bit more alert and a bit more fresh. Although that might be hard if they have to go to school and things like that. So there's something to take note of. Maybe for morning session, they still train 2 times a day, unlike not so common. They can focus on the skills training in the morning and then maybe the non-skills at the later part of the day.
The other point I thought maybe Jamie could help us with is the effects of dehydration. If you're not consuming liquids throughout the day, I mean, there's no getting around that. You will see some issues with dehydration, would you not?
Yeah, I think we may face some potential issues with dehydration. So I think, like what you say, there's no getting around it, and it also depends on what time the training session is. Yeah, so if there is like from breakfast until training, there is about half an hour to 1 hour. What we recommend is that the athlete try and take frequent sips of water to just push up the hydration status. The reason why I say frequent sips as compared to like big gulps of water, like a water parade, is because if you drink too much at one go, actually the body end up not retaining it. Yeah, and the athlete end up peeing it out rather than the body using the water or the fluid for hydration. Yeah, so it's better to take like frequent sips. So if it's 500 ml rather than gulping it down like a water parade, it's like to take 500 ml over the course of the half an hour to one hour. Yeah, yeah. So that was what I would recommend. Yeah, for dehydration, or that rather to manage or prevent it.
So sip, don't gulp.
Yeah, not big gulp. Yeah.
I guess the other question I also have is, what practical adaptations Muslim athletes can make overall, right? There's food, there's sleep, there's hydration. Not sure whether Matt, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think one of the probably the key findings from this and the other research that Dr. Rashid and Ray have done is a lot of it is really just common sense. So if you're a coach or if you're an athlete, don't have your very high intensity sessions in the morning when you know you have maybe 10 hours or so before you can eat or consume liquid. So as Sofyan said, focus more on your technical sessions or tactical sessions when they're maybe a little bit more cognitively alert during that time, so they can maybe take that in. And then save your harder sessions either to maybe an hour or so before they can break fast, or even more ideally, maybe slightly afterwards. So allow the athletes to break fast with a small meal around 7 o'clock, then maybe train afterwards, and then have a larger meal following training. That sort of adapting of schedule is, while not difficult on paper, we recognize that actually the realities for many athletes may be a bit more difficult than that. As Sophie mentioned, in the study of the elite badminton players, they were able to go back to sleep after their morning meal. But for a lot of our student athletes, obviously, they don't have that luxury. They have to go to school straight away. So there are obviously limitations, like even when we compare ourselves to other countries. So in Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, even regionally in Indonesia or Malaysia, they may make societal changes and make it slightly easier for the athletes. But for us, Muslims in Singapore just sort of have to get on with it. Like school start times are not going to change, training times are probably not going to change. But I think it is just about coaches and athletes adopting a common sense approach, and then so you can survive the month without any major issues.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that, yes, you have to stay awake in class. That's one challenge. And then after that, you have to stay awake to do your homework, which is a second challenge. And so there's this, cognitive load on you just to concentrate and do your homework. And there's no rest. And that must have some effects, but, this is the Singapore life we have signed up for. I think that the other question I had is about whether fasting has an effect on athletes who play indoors, air-conditioned, as opposed to athletes who have to train or compete outdoors, non-air-conditioned, and obviously, different issues. And then if you get say a sport where you have morning heats and then evening finals, like what happens in swimming, that must take some doing in terms of, planning your meals, your recovery.
So maybe I'll answer the first question first. So yes, obviously there is a difference playing indoor and outdoor because the thermal load is different. So, and we know for sure that the thermal load will have an effect on the athlete, uh, perceived exertion and things like that. So yes, there is a difference between those who are playing indoors and those playing outdoors. But how much of a significant difference? Good question. I would think there is, but I cannot tell you how much of a difference there would be.
Okay, perhaps a study for another time. Matt, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I think regarding the competition piece, if I remember correctly, the London Olympics in 2012 was during Ramadan, and I believe YOG in 2010, when we hosted it in Singapore, was also during Ramadan. So these are very real issues, and I think particularly around London, it became a lot more prominent because at that time in Europe, they were fasting, I think, for like 18 hours or perhaps even longer. So obviously, Muslim athletes were very heightened awareness of that. Obviously, Muslim athletes do have a choice. They can, if they feel like they're not able to compete and it potentially is dangerous for them to compete while fasting, they can not fast for that particular day and then make up that day after Ramadan has ended. And obviously, some athletes make that choice to do that. Others work with someone like Jamie, a nutritionist, to come up with a strategy of how they're basically going to fuel their body to sort of survive that day of competition. So potentially, like I say, it could be heats in the morning, finals in the afternoon. So they would have to come up with a strategy that they would hopefully test a number of times in the build up to that competition to basically allow them to be able to fulfill that demand of that day or that week of competition.
Just doubling back to intermittent fasting, is that incompatible with elite youth performance? Jamie, what do you think?
I wouldn't recommend it because I think at the youth level, we are still talking a lot about acquiring the necessary skills and the technicalities, which carbohydrates, for example, are actually quite important, or rather staying well fueled is quite important for youth athletes. Because I think sometimes when we talk about fuel, we associate it with having enough energy. But what goes on physiologically, it would be things like the nerve adaptations and the neuromuscular adaptations that take place, which is something that we may not feel but comes in quite subtly. Yeah, and those are times whereby having sufficient fuel is quite important. So I wouldn't recommend intermittent fasting to youth athletes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. And on that note, thank you very much, everybody. Obviously, there's more to this topic, and Sofyan's study is worth a read. So we'll share that in the link or the comments below, and we'll catch you all next time. Thanks, everybody, for chipping in.
Thanks, Les.